Hello and welcome to the Texas Tribune TribCast for Tuesday, August 12th. I am Matthew Watkins, editor-in-chief of the Tribune, and I am joined by, as usual, our law and politics reporter, Eleanor Klibanoff. Hello, Eleanor.
Hello, Matthew. How are you?
I'm doing well. We were just talking about how you've been doing the yeoman's work of Googling synonyms for unprecedented.
Yes, very March 2020 vibes,
Yeah.
but more on the Texas legal politics side.
I feel like this is just, I feel like the common debate among reporters right now is like, what's another word for flee the state, you know? And I
Yes.
feel like people are really, going decamp,
Abscond.
abscond. Yeah, really
Yeah.
stretching the limits of our language here to find.
We've gotten some negative feedback on flee. People who are sort of supportive of the Democrats and feel like flee implies, doing so perhaps without cause or without, sort of more of a cowardly move, which I think we've certainly heard
Mhm.
Republicans sort of framing it that way.
Mhm.
I kind of think flee is, you can flee in defense of democracy, which
Right,
is what
you
they're
can flee, a nuclear bomb, right? It
exactly. Are
doesn't
we
make
saying
you.
that people who flee nuclear
I
bombs
don't.
are cowards?
I don't think there's a value judgment here.
That's what we say. But
Exactly.
yeah, it's a so yeah, we abscond on the lam. That one feels more criminal.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're
If
struggling.
Eleanor.klibanoff@texastribune.org if anyone has any language recommendations for us.
My email has been um
Okay, maybe you don't
horrible.
need me
Yeah,
giving that
don't
out.
email me.
I apologize.
I will say one thing, and I want to publicly mea culpa for this.
Hmm.
I made an error in a story today,
Okay.
and people emailed me so aggressively. But to be fair, it was warranted. I engaged in Bill Clements erasure. I misstated what year Texas elected its first Republican governor.
Mm.
People emailed me so irate on behalf of Bill Clements. And that's fair. I did get it. I was an error. I introduced an error in there. And it's amazing how intense people were about that.
They always say, you don't mess with the Bill Clements hive. That's
Exactly.
that's
Yeah.
rule number one of
the
Texas
beehive.
journalism.
Yeah.
Yeah, the beehive.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly right. All right. Well, this week, if you haven't picked up on it already, we are going to continue talking about the quorum break, and we're going to take a little visit to law school,
Yes.
which I think is probably exciting to you.
Very
Eleanor.
exciting to
Yeah.
me. Yeah.
Catching people up. I'm sure most people listening to this show already know, but Texas Democrats in the Texas House remain outside of the state. Their fleeing has continued, if you will. But the fight has shifted maybe a little bit more to the courtroom. State leaders, since we last spoke, including Greg Abbott and Ken Paxton, we'll get into that in a little bit, have filed lawsuits seeking to remove 13 Democrats in the Texas House, including House Democratic leader Gene Wu, from office, basically claiming that they have abandoned their duties as elected officials. It is an unprecedented step in which the Texas Supreme Court will likely ultimately decide the fate of those lawmakers in the coming days or maybe weeks. Joining us to help us understand this is David Froomkin, a law professor at the University of Houston who studies administrative law, election law, and democratic and constitutional theory, which sounds like a pretty good CV for the conversation we're about to have.
The guy we needed.
Exactly. So, David, thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you.
All right, so I'm going to start with you, Eleanor, and I'm going to ask you to explain what these legal filings are before we go to David to help us understand whether there's anything to these legal filings. So just sum up for us as quickly as you can what legal actions Abbott and Paxton have taken against these Democrats.
Yeah, and I will say this is like one of the best parts definitively of being a journalist is that like you can wake up on a Monday a week ago and have never heard the phrase quo warranto in your life. And by the end of the week, I'm sitting here being like, everybody knows like, to file an information on a quo warranto proceeding, you got to follow these different steps. Thanks to legal experts like Professor Froomkin who educate us all on the fly. But that's basically what this is. They have asked first Governor Abbott has asked the Texas Supreme Court to remove House Democratic Caucus Chair Gene Wu through this quo warranto proceeding. Attorney General Paxton followed up with his own suit on seeking to remove 13 members through the same mechanism, one Wu and 12 others. And yeah, it's a unprecedented filing to be used for a quorum break. It is basically if a public official, it can also be used in corporate settings, but putting that aside for a second, if a public official has vacated their office or abandoned their office, it is how you get them formally removed from office. It, there are there's like rare precedent in how this has been used in, these sort of in general, like how do you get somebody out of office? It has never been used in a quorum break setting.
Okay. So, David, I want to ask you first with a very simple question. I mean, is there anything laid out in the Constitution or elsewhere that sort of defines what kind of abandoning your office means? Is that like, what do we have to go with to evaluate whether these Democrats have actually abandoned their office?
The Constitution says that when a vacancy occurs in a legislative position, then it is the job of the governor to call a special election to fill that vacancy. It doesn't provide an exhaustive list of the conditions under which a vacancy would occur. And the legal theory underlying these actions is that a court is entitled to identify a vacancy under this kind of circumstance.
This circumstance being essentially leaving the state in an effort to make it impossible for the Texas House to do its job, to function, essentially.
Right. I mean, this is a thing, though. I mean, Texas lawmakers have been breaking quorum, as we call it, since like the 1870s. Our founding fathers, for reasons that we don't know, but our founding fathers set our quorum very high. They gave us a 2/3 quorum. We're one of only 4 states that has a 2/3 quorum. It is notable. Those are the only states that really have ever had quorum breaks. Most states, 50%, fine, whatever. Here, 2/3. The legal experts or the historians I've talked to feel like this reflects early Texas's wanting to make government difficult, small and difficult to enact. We don't know that for sure, though.
Okay. So, I mean, David, help us analyze these legal arguments. Then, what do you think about the case that Abbott and Paxton are making about, that what they have done actually constitutes, abandonment of office?
I think the case offered by both the governor and the attorney general is very weak. They really haven't pointed to any precedent that supports their position. In fact, the precedents they cite tend to support the alternative view that these legislators have not abandoned their positions because they intend to hold and exercise their positions. They're doing what they're doing in order to advance their legislative goals. The precedents that both the governor and the attorney general cited suggest that a court could identify an instance of abandonment when a legislative office holder is no longer trying to exercise their office. Say they've gone off on a cruise for a year and they're not even engaged in legislative business. That's a far cry from the kind of situation we're looking at here.
So, I mean, basically, what you're saying, what I think the Democrats are maybe arguing as well, is that leaving the state to break quorum is not an abandonment of office. It's actually it's a constitutionally created function lever that they have to execute kind of their political or legislative goals.
That's certainly what the Democrats are saying. I mean, they're saying like the constituents we represent in our blue districts do not want these new maps. We have no way to sort of represent them and block these maps by staying here. So to best represent them, we must leave the state and stop the maps from being passed. And we might get into this, but the Texas Supreme Court ruled in 2021 that the Texas Constitution enables quorum breaking. That was their term. It also, though, enables quorum forcing, which is like, and they say that is something the chambers can do. They can set fines, they can set censure, they can even vote to expel a member over breaking quorum. You would need quorum and a 2/3 vote to expel a member. So, that's a tricky thing for them to sort of get around now that this basically, essentially more or less the same Supreme Court said the Constitution enables quorum breaking.
Okay, so what you are citing here is an opinion by Justice Jimmy Blacklock, who
Now Chief Justice
who is now Chief Justice. Exactly. This is dating back to 2021, right, when lawmakers fled the state to stop a bill that would impose new voting restrictions. The House issued warrants to bring them back to the Capitol, which is, as you mentioned, allowed in the Constitution. And Blacklock wrote, I'm going to just read the quote here, while it being the Constitution, I believe, does enable quorum breaking by a minority faction, it also enables the remaining members to compel the attendance of absent members. The 2/3 quorum rule protects against legislative action by a smaller fraction of the body. And so there we go. It's done, right? They're going to reject this? Is that the...
Well, Governor Abbott has argued in his filing, and David, I'm curious your thoughts on this argument, because I found it sort of a compelling framing to say, well, the highway enables you to drive 120 miles per hour. If you keep doing that, eventually we're going to take away your license. I mean, what do you sort of make of that argument that enabled is not doing as much work as people think it is in that ruling?
I think the important thing to understand here is that there would be a very fundamental separation of powers problem with a judicial officer coming in and trying to impose rules on the House. The Constitution assigns to the House the power to make its own rules of procedure. That implies that there are pretty strong limits on the ability of either the executive or the judiciary to come in and try to supersede those choices by the House. In fact, the Texas Constitution has a stronger separation of powers than the federal Constitution. It has a separation of powers clause that makes explicit that where the Texas Constitution assigns to one branch of government a power, it prohibits the other branches from intruding on the exercise of that power. And that's exactly what the governor and the attorney general, in my view, are asking a court to do here.
Well, that's interesting because we've seen this come up recently in other cases, right? The Ken Paxton remains very upset with some members of the Court of Criminal Appeals, right? Because they prevented him from prosecuting voter fraud cases, if I'm not mistaken, claiming that same separation of powers. Essentially, the AG's office is part of the executive branch.
They can't. And in that case, they have to be invited in by the district attorney.
Yeah.
That's like not a power given to them.
Exactly.
Right. Which we should say in that case, Attorney General Ken Paxton was very upset with that ruling. He worked to unseat 3 incumbents on that court. 2 more have said that they are not going to run for re-election. And there's already been some rhetoric around, from one person in particular, Michael Quinn Sullivan, has said, like, the eyes of Texas Republican primary voters are on the Texas Supreme Court with this case now. Like, all they have to do is look at what happened with the Court of Criminal Appeals. Like, there is a lot of pressure on the Supreme Court right now. I would say, frankly, I think Governor Abbott and Attorney General Paxton have put them in a bit of a bind here.
Right. Because the other difference between, the federal Constitution and the federal courts and the state courts is that the state courts are elected, right? And so, in this state, we have 9 Republican members who face, the most important election that will be involved in will be in primaries, including, if I'm not mistaken, Eleanor, 3 next year, right? I think there are a lot of people watching this. Jimmy Blacklock, again, you mentioned the Chief Justice. He wrote that opinion. He was also appointed by Governor Abbott, as were many other members of the Supreme Court. I think there is a question of is there going to be intense pressure, electoral or otherwise, to go along with what Abbott and Paxton are going for. David, I wonder what you think about that fear by many conservatives. I mean, do you think that's a reasonable concern that some Democrats have?
Well, I guess I can't really answer that question as a legal expert. I mean, I will say that I think there are some strong arguments for having a popularly accountable judiciary. It's a good thing that ultimately public officials are accountable to the people. And at the end of the day, the question is going to be, what will the people put up with in their public officials?
I mean, and where we stand now, the Texas Supreme Court has issued this extended deadline. So Governor Abbott asked, and just for context here, right? Governor Abbott, a former member of the Texas Supreme Court, a former attorney general, he has appointed 6 of these 9 justices, many of whom have gone on, or all of whom now have gone, many of whom have gone on to win re-election on their own. 2 of them are his former general counsels, including Chief Justice Blacklock. He some legal experts said, somewhat presumptively, asked the Supreme Court to rule on this, what he called a constitutional crisis case, in 48 hours. They did not take him up on that. And just last night, they issued this briefing schedule that will put us basically past Labor Day before we get a decision on this, which buying themselves some time, it seems like.
Yeah, what do you make of that, David? I mean, I think what that does is it brings us to a situation where we're probably going to go past the special session period before we get a ruling on this. I mean, obviously Abbott can and will call another special session if this one ends. And in fact, I think Dan Patrick came out today and said that he might
And House
end the
Speaker
session.
Burrows, yeah, they said that they would adjourn Friday if they don't have quorum and immediately start the 30-day clock over.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But is there anything to read into this kind of rejection of Abbott's request to rule very quickly on this and to hear briefings and kind of let this play out?
I don't think it was at all surprising, particularly in a situation where the Attorney General was suggesting that there was a standing problem with the governor's filing. So there are a lot of procedural issues, complicated procedural issues that the court will want to look into before it rules on this question. The standing issue is not the only one. There's actually a very fundamental jurisdictional issue here. The jurisdictional provision that both the governor and the attorney general have suggested as the basis for the Supreme Court's ability to rule on this question, arguably does not extend to making a determination about a legislative vacancy. The language of that jurisdictional statute says that they can rule on this kind of action with respect to an officer of state government. But the Supreme Court has previously interpreted that language to refer to a narrower class of officials that doesn't include legislators.
And David, is what you're talking about here this idea that it seems as though the rules for how you go about getting this removal is you go to a district court first, presumably one that is within the jurisdiction. I also believe it doesn't explicitly allow for the governor to make this filing. Is that sort of what you're talking about here?
So there are two separate issues there. One about the standing of the governor specifically, but you're absolutely right. I think the proper jurisdictional course would have been to go to a district court first, rather than trying to have an expedited proceeding before the Supreme Court.
I mean, this has been messy, right? I mean, you sort of mentioned this, right? With Attorney General Paxton has raised standing issues about Governor Abbott being able to bring this. I think there's been sort of a degree of infighting in the courts that creates a lot of this uncertainty and sort of creates, I think, an opening for the courts to say, like, we need a minute.
Yeah, let's actually step back and just walk
Yeah.
through that process, because I think like you said, it's messy. It's also kind of fascinating and
Yes.
interesting. There's a lot of dynamics here. So on August 3rd, Democrats leave the state. Greg Abbott, I think that same day, essentially threatens to remove them, saying that, we will take action to this. I think, I will speak for myself here. When I read that as not necessarily meaning that he would file it, but that, someone in Texas would file it. But regardless, that's what happens. A day later, the House issues arrest warrants for the members, just quickly,
Standard fare.
right? Standard fare. It means you can arrest them and essentially bring them back to the House. It doesn't mean you're
Within
like
state lines.
going to charge
Yeah.
them. Yeah. And you can only arrest people within state lines. And then Paxton on August 5th announces that he'll seek orders to remove Democrats from their seats if they don't return by that Friday. Hours later, Governor Abbott files to specifically remove Gene Wu, the House Democratic leader, which then leads maybe like an hour later for Paxton to write a letter to the Supreme Court, essentially saying, Governor Abbott means well here, but, we all know he can't actually do this. Where it kind of looks like these two, high profile statewide elected officials are sort of fighting each other over who gets the right to throw out these Democrats. Meanwhile, our senior state senator John Cornyn, who faces a primary challenge from Attorney General Ken Paxton, is essentially just lobbing grenades from Washington D.C. at Ken Paxton, essentially saying, he's not doing enough. He's on a European vacation. Like, Greg Abbott is having to step in and do the work for the Attorney General without him. And so it's this fascinating and maybe I will say hilarious, kind of like fight within the political fight over who can do this and what kind of, I guess, political benefit they can get from being able to do it.
Right. And Paxton originally said, which I think legal experts sort of agree with, he said, like, we would have to file each of the,
Yeah.
he was like, this is going to be a challenge. We're going to have to file in everyone's individual jurisdiction. This would have to be, we're going to be in blue counties, da, da, da. And now he came in, like you said, after these, bombs are being thrown at him and files in the Supreme Court and says, like, oh, no, 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 no. I can file in the Supreme Court directly, actually. Governor Abbott, we should say, is arguing he can, the one part of state statute says a quo warranto proceeding can only be brought by the county or district attorney or the attorney general in district court. Governor Abbott says, I'm citing a different part of state statute. Now, Attorney General Paxton is saying, I'm citing that part of statute, but I think we can go directly to the Texas Supreme Court. So you can sort of understand the Texas Supreme Court saying, like, we're going to need a minute on all of this. To your point, David, just like the standing and the jurisdictional issues and even before we get to the unprecedented question of, is this vacating an office? Like, they've created a little bit of and they have now consolidated those cases together and have basically said, and this morning, late last night, Attorney General Ken Paxton said he looks forward to fighting alongside Governor Abbott on this. So we're all friends again. Yeah.
So I guess, David, what can you tell us about, like, what we should expect and how we should watch this in the coming days, weeks, and months? I mean, how does this, do we know, is there enough precedent to know how this plays out in the coming weeks?
Well, as I've said, I think there's absolutely no precedent supporting the position of the plaintiffs here. I think it would be really shocking if the Supreme Court were to find any merit in these claims that, in my view, seem to be completely without merit, even after you address the procedural problems. As you said a few minutes ago, the Supreme Court said just 4 years ago that legislators are entitled to engage in quorum breaking. It would be pretty shocking for them to execute a complete about face just 4 years later, and to say not only is that something they're not permitted to do, it is something that means they have forfeited their offices. I mean, that seems so radical and surprising in view of the precedents and the very clear separation of powers issues here.
Let me just play like a little bit of, like, try to take the other side of this argument right now. I mean, I think we should eventually at some point talk about kind of the issues of democracy in all of this, but it is not the most democratic thing for a small minority of, the clear minority of a legislative body to be able to halt the entire work and functioning of the legislature in order to stop one particular bill that they
Sure.
don't like, right? Theoretically, these lawmakers could just make the decision to never come back, and then we just don't have a legislature anymore. Like, I mean, should there not be some kind of mechanism within the law to allow a constitutionally created branch of government to function, despite, and overcome a minority faction of that, trying to prevent them from functioning, period.
Right. I mean, that's Governor Abbott's argument. And, like, I mean, you can say some of this is sort of a little bit of sort of taking this to its worst extreme, but he's saying, like, we could bankrupt the state. Like, they could just stay away. They could never pass a budget. They could never return. They'd have to return to probably run for their seats again. But, like, you can do that over Zoom these days. Like, we could just shut down the Texas forever.
Yeah.
I do think, and frankly, I think a lot of this, and I've heard this from some Republican lawmakers, is the fact that they also broke quorum in 2021. There's this sense that this is now like a tool that's going to be used
more frequently
right, against anything they don't like. Of course, Democrats would say, like, this is such a, once in a lifetime thing. I would say that, like, the remedy for the typical remedy for that, right, is like you can't just go to the courts and say, like, we think this is insane that you can do this, is like change the law, right? The House has done some of that. They've created increased House rules.
But how can you change the law
You
if they're
need
not?
it's a constitutional amendment.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
need a 2/3 vote. I mean, like I just talked yesterday to Representative Cody Vasut, who's chairing the redistricting committee. He, since 2021, has filed several bills to reduce quorum to 50%, like almost every other state. The problem is it's a constitutional amendment. You need a 2/3 majority to get that done. So they are in a little bit of a
pickle.
bind here. I will
Yeah.
say that part of this is that if they do get those vacancies declared, the quorum reduces. I bet they just would go ahead and while they've got this reduced quorum, pass a bill that says quorum's 50%. So like there's a lot that could suddenly happen if they were to take that sort of extraordinary step.
Yeah, David, what do you think about that question?
It's a really great question, and it really goes to the merits of the constitutional rule. As you observed earlier, it's an unusual rule by the standards of state constitutions, setting a 2/3 quorum requirement for the House, and arguably not a great rule, although the history suggests that it did tend to promote more collegiality and cooperation in the Texas legislature than in many state legislatures. But I do agree with the observation that majority rule is a very central principle of democracy, and we should ask questions about rules that empower a minority to obstruct majority rule. But there's a process for reforming those institutions. And in a society with the rule of law, you need to follow the rules to change the rules. When you don't do that, you are really not complying with the rule of law, and that's really disturbing.
Okay. Eleanor, game out for me. What happens if these 13 members are tossed from office? What next?
Well, I get to use a pre-write that I am that's currently burning a hole in my pocket. I mean, I think if those 13 are removed, it technically opens the door for any Democrat who does not return to be removed. It effectively ends quorum breaking as a strategy for any minority party in Texas. I mean, one question I do have that's like a legal question is like they're at 95 to 97, like they're pretty close to quorum. If they make quorum, can the Texas Supreme Court just throw this out as moot? Like, can we resolve this constitutional crisis that way?
I don't know. I mean, it seems like the theory in this case is that legislators who are not showing up are in so doing producing a vacancy, and it doesn't seem like that goes away just because other legislators have shown up. I mean, it seems pretty clear to me that not showing up for the purpose of denying the House a quorum does not constitute an abandonment of office, but I'm not sure that it would be mooted just because other legislators show up.
Although, history suggests that once they have a quorum, the other members show up too, right? And that
right.
that it would be harder to make the case that they've abandoned their office if they have shown back up to the legislature to do the work.
Right. Like, I think probably if they make quorum, the people who are facing expulsion from office might make haste and return.
Yeah.
Also, though, they might want a ruling on this. They might want to force the courts to. So I think there's so much unresolved that, we're not going to get an answer for several weeks. We're not going to get maps for several weeks, it seems, unless by some miracle they make quorum on Friday. So, this is going to be much more extended than we thought, I think.
Okay, but I want to lay out, there's the legal precedent and what happens on there, but there's also just the like practicality of getting these new maps passed, right? So correct me if I'm wrong here, but if the lawmakers are thrown out, the quorum, the threshold to meet quorum is 2/3 of the members of the body, not 2/3 of the 150 constitutionally created House seats.
Correct.
So Republicans would be able to meet quorum with a number of Democrats kicked out,
Correct.
which would mean they could come back together, pass out these maps,
and
maybe
the rest of the agenda.
Maybe we go through this whole process again with the Senate. We would have to see, but essentially, pass the rest of the agenda that they have through. Then Abbott would be expected to call a special election those members who were kicked out could run again and essentially win their seats back. So we're essentially like, there is a world where we sort of return to the status quo, except the bills that are up in the special session have passed during that brief period of time where we have fewer or maybe even no Democrats in the Texas House.
Right. We come back in 2027 with the same
People.
essentially.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Except
right.
they're all a little bit more mad at each other than they were before.
I think arguably a lot more mad. I mean, I do think like this is like this whole episode, whatever happens, is such a blow to whatever shreds of bipartisanship were left.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it well, and it's not just bipartisanship to it. It seems like there are all these little things that are happening where the ability of the people of Texas to choose their elected representation are being limited, right? So, I mean, the maps themselves are an example of this, right? They are taking this step, outside the norm. It's happened one time before, but to essentially draw seats that will determine who will win the seats in advance. This, is nothing completely new, but it's a more extreme step in order to do that. You have this idea of removing democratically elected Democrats, low capital D democratically elected capital D Democrats from office for doing something that, I suspect that the people that put them in office support, right? Separate from that, completely unrelated to this whole fight, we have this parallel process that's going on right now in the Republican Party, where essentially the state Republican Executive Committee, a small committee of elected but very activist wing people of the party, are pursuing the power to censure members of their own party in the Texas House, Republican members who did not align with some of the priorities of the party, with the goal of banning them from being able to be on the primary ballot in 2026. Essentially then again, a small committee of people deciding to disqualify people who have been elected by the people in their district to represent them. It just seems to me like there are a lot of aspects of democracy that are not looking real great right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this is like sort of walking us towards very, very shaky ground. And like, to have a governor who's a former Supreme Court justice, a former attorney general, by all respects, like a very smart lawyer, even just like tempt the court with this legal argument. It's a new, I don't know, it's a new chapter we're in. I mean, David, like when you look at this in terms of like where like our democracy is gonna be when this all resolves, like what's your diagnosis?
I would say it's pretty bleak. I mean, we've talked a lot about the violations of the state constitution that would be created if courts were to accept these theories that the governor and the attorney general are advancing. But I think it's worth taking a step back and focusing on the objective that this is all directed toward. I mean, we're talking here about a very unusual mid-decade redistricting that pretty clearly is only happening in order to gerrymander the House map. I mean, mid-decade redistrictings historically really have not happened when the same party drew the initial map. That's what's really unusual here. And on top of that, they did so with a stated objective of reducing the representation of communities of color, likely making this redistricting plan illegal under federal law as a racial gerrymander before you even get to the potential violations of the Voting Rights Act. Now, it has to be said that the US Supreme Court has contributed a lot to the perilous state that American democracy is in. I would really lay a lot of the blame at the feet of the US Supreme Court, fundamentally for blessing partisan gerrymandering in 2019, saying that state legislatures are permitted to engage in any degree of partisan gerrymandering. That really is what opened the floodgates, as we're now seeing. On top of that, though, the Supreme Court indicated just last week that it is likely to further constrict the protections of the Voting Rights Act, which was the one real protection in federal law restraining partisan gerrymandering if the Supreme Court were to do what a lot of experts expect it will do in this Louisiana case that has just been scheduled for re-argument in mid-October, that would dismantle the one really substantial remaining check on the ability of, in particular, Southern legislatures to thoroughly gerrymander maps to deny members of minority groups any political representation.
Yeah, I mean, and we also just are in this scenario now where it really just feels like maximum political warfare, right? And how do we get to a point where that's no longer the case? Right before we started recording this, Ken Paxton put out a press release where he's saying he's asking a local district judge to jail Beto O'Rourke for what defying a court order to stop fundraising for the Democrats as a part of this quorum break. He quoted a quote from O'Rourke at a Fort Worth rally on Saturday where O'Rourke said, there are no refs in this game. Fuck the rules. Right. And
well, we're getting kicked off Apple Podcasts, but that's fine.
People cut.
They know.
Joe Rogan is like the most popular. I mean, one of the things you have heard from Democrats in response to this redistricting plan is like, it's time to stop playing nice. It's time to, we're going to do this, what the Republicans are doing in Texas, we're going to do in California, and we're going to do in New York. And it seems like each side keeps just wanting to kind of up the game out of what they view as an existential danger created by the other side in a way that it just is very hard for me to figure out what the sort of release valve is for all this pressure.
And I think, we have a story today in which I accurately describe Bill Clements as the first Republican governor of Texas, in which we talk about like how I think this is true I think blue states are, like you said, are pushing this like maximum politics idea. Texas is as well. And Texas just has so much Republican power, right?
Yeah.
I mean, every branch of government in Texas is so securely dominated by the furthest reaches of the party that it's like, I think that's part of why it feels so extreme in one direction here. And we hear this from Republicans a lot. Well, Illinois does it too, and New York does it too. And like you said, absolutely, both sides have pushed each other to the edge, but we just have such complete dominance of one party here.
Yeah, but I mean, it is worth thinking about how, I think I made this point last week too, but it's worth making again that the legislative session started this year with a robust debate about shared governance and the power and allowing Democrats to be a part of the process, right? And the person who won the House Speaker's race won that race with the support of Democrats. And now here we are 8 months later, and those same Democrats are being, attempts are being made to forcefully remove them from office.
R.I.P. those vice chairmanships that they fought so hard for. I mean, I just do think that like this, when I say like this is sort of the end of any bipartisanship, like you said, 8 months ago, we were saying, should Democrats be chairs of committees in the House or just vice chairs of committees? And where are we gonna, and now it's like they're going to be stripped of their, almost certainly, right? There's a lot of talk about it. They're going to be stripped of their vice chairmanships. That era, I think we will look back quaintly on that as like, the time when Democrats held chairs in the Texas legislature. I mean, I think the House is going to look a lot more like the Senate in terms of just like mono party dominance. And, a lot of Republicans say like that's overdue. We've been too cautious.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, David, do let's talk about your democratic and constitutional theory part of your areas of research. Do you agree with our assessment? Do you see any opportunity here to cool the temperature in any way?
Well, I think one of the tragedies here is that there is going to be a cycle of tit for tat where states with Democratic legislatures are understandably going to feel that they have to respond. If you know your game theory, you know that you're just encouraging more bad behavior on the other side if you don't have a proportional response. So I think, whereas historically blue states really had a lot more interest in creating independent redistricting commissions and developing other state law constraints on partisan gerrymandering. For example, California has an independent commission. New York has state constitutional constraints on partisan gerrymandering. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure for backsliding in those blue states on these issues, which might be necessary from a game theory perspective in the situation that we're in, but is a sad thing for our democracy in the aggregate when progress toward improving the districting process is going to be rolled back as a result of these gerrymanders that are taking place.
Yeah.
All
Nobody's
right.
coming out of this unscathed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Well, something tells me we'll be talking about this next week
Yeah.
too, but I think this is a good place to stop right now. Thank you, David, for joining us and providing your insight. Thank you, Eleanor. And thank you to our producers, Rob and Chris. We will talk to y'all next week.